As the search for answers into Nancy Guthrie's disappearance continues, over the last week, so many people still showing up and showing their support for Savannah.
I've watched the Today Show for many years, and you become family.
We're not going to stop praying until we get an answer, and some closure.
Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos telling us they're still working to identify that masked man at Nancy's home.
Do you think that this suspect could strike again, whoever did this?
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, criminal minds are criminal minds.
Well, he didn't disclose it. The sheriff says investigators do have a theory for a motive.
The country was told to focus on one night. One masked figure, one front door, one terrifying moment outside the home of 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie in the early hours of February 1, 2026. That was the version that spread fastest. A stranger appears in black and white surveillance images. A camera is tampered with. An elderly woman vanishes from her bedroom in the dark. The public sees a mystery shaped like a single event, a single intrusion, a single narrow window of violence. But as the days passed and more reporting began to surface, that version stopped feeling complete. Because the deeper investigators looked, the more one disturbing possibility began to rise above everything else. What happened to Nancy may not have begun on the night she disappeared. It may have started earlier. And if it started earlier, then this was not simply an intruder passing through the desert and finding the wrong house at the right time. It may have been something colder than that, something studied, something deliberate. Nancy Guthrie was not a public figure in the usual sense. She was not someone who lived under the glare of cameras or drew the kind of attention that turns private suffering into national headlines. She was an 84-year-old woman living in the Catalina foothills north of Tucson, Arizona, in a home she had known for decades. The house sat in the kind of quiet space where desert darkness feels deeper, where long driveways disappear into shadow, and where silence after midnight can feel absolute. Her family described her as mentally sharp, independent, and deeply rooted in routine. She had a pacemaker. She needed daily medication. Her mobility was limited, but her life was stable, predictable, familiar. That stability is part of what makes this case so unsettling. Everything about Nancy's world suggests routine. Nothing about what happened next does. On the evening of January 31, Nancy spent time with family. She had dinner with her daughter Annie and Annie's husband. By all public accounts, it was an ordinary family night. They ate together. They spent time together. There was no public sign of crisis attached to those final known hours before she returned home. At some point between roughly 9:30 and 9:50 p.m., Nancy was driven back to her house. The son-in-law later said he made sure she got inside safely before leaving and driving back to his own home, a short distance away. For a few hours after that, the story goes quiet. Then the timeline fractures. At 1:47 a.m. on February 1, Nancy's Nest doorbell camera was disconnected. Not glitched, not interrupted by weather, not lost to some random technical failure. According to investigators, it was physically disabled. Whoever approached that home did not simply happen upon a camera. The camera was dealt with. That detail matters because it turns the front of the house into the first known point of deliberate action. Then, at 2:12 a.m., another camera on the property registered what the system classified as a person. But Nancy reportedly did not have active cloud subscriptions on all of her devices, meaning the detection event did not leave behind the kind of video investigators and the public would desperately wish existed now. There was a digital whisper of movement, but not a full visual record. 16 minutes later, at 2:28 a.m., Nancy's pacemaker app lost connection with her phone. That may sound small on first hearing, like a technical footnote. It is not. That disconnect may represent one of the most important moments in the entire case. It suggests that within 41 minutes of the front camera going dark, something had changed dramatically. Either the phone was moved, destroyed, separated from Nancy by distance, or Nancy herself was moved far enough from it for the signal to fail. However it happened, the technology that quietly tracked part of her physical condition stopped communicating in the way it normally did. 41 minutes. That is one of the numbers hanging over this case. Not 4 minutes, not 8, not the kind of fast smash-and-grab window associated with ordinary burglary. 41 minutes between the disabling of the camera and the loss of pacemaker connection. That span is long enough to change the entire character of the crime. Investigators and former profilers publicly discussing the case have pointed to that gap as deeply significant. A person entering a home with a simple goal of quick theft does not usually stay that long. A 41-minute window suggests complication, control, resistance, staging, searching, waiting, or some combination of those things. It suggests that the person inside that home was not improvising blindly for a few chaotic seconds. It suggests time, enough time to manage a situation. And then came the next cruel part of the timeline, the delay before anyone knew she was gone. Nancy was reported missing around noon the next day after she failed to appear for a virtual church service. That created roughly a 12-hour gap between the last known technological sign linked to her and the point at which the alarm truly began. In missing person investigations, time is not just important, it is everything. 12 hours is the difference between a tight radius and an expanding map. It is the difference between immediate containment and a huge head start. In 12 hours, someone can cross state lines, approach the border, change vehicles, abandon evidence, or vanish into a region large enough to swallow a lead whole. When investigators entered Nancy's world as an active crime scene, they did not find a peaceful, empty house with no signs of conflict. They found indications that something violent or forceful had occurred. Blood was found on the porch and later publicly identified as Nancy's. There were signs of disturbance near the entrance. The doorbell camera had been physically removed from its mount. Inside the home, investigators located biological evidence. Public reporting later indicated that DNA recovered there did not belong to Nancy and did not match known family reference samples that had been compared at that stage. That alone would be major. But it was not the end of the forensic story. A glove was found roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home in a roadside field. During large-scale search operations, many items get collected and examined, and most turn out to have nothing to do with the crime at all. But this glove drew attention because it reportedly resembled the kind seen in the surveillance images. DNA was recovered from inside it. That profile, according to reporting on the investigation, did not match the DNA found inside Nancy's house. It also did not produce a match in the National Criminal Database. That means that by this point in the public narrative, there were 2 separate unknown male DNA profiles potentially tied to the case. 2 profiles, 2 unknowns. That detail alone changed the way many people began to understand what might have happened. If both pieces of biological evidence truly connect back to the disappearance, then the case may not be pointing toward a single actor at all. It may point toward more than one person moving through different parts of the event, or it may point toward contamination, misdirection, or a layered crime scene investigators still have not publicly explained in full. But whatever the answer is, it adds complexity. It means this was never going to be a simple story. And then there were the images. On February 10, the FBI publicly released surveillance materials showing an armed individual at Nancy's front door. The figure appeared in dark clothing with a ski mask and gloves. At first glance, the pictures carried the force of a straightforward narrative. Here is the suspect. Here is the house. Here is the moment before Nancy vanished. But later reporting from major news organizations began raising a critical question about the dating of at least one of those images. According to sources cited in those reports, one photograph may not have come from the morning of Nancy's disappearance at all. It may have been captured on an earlier date. That changes everything. Because if the suspect appeared at Nancy's home before the actual abduction window, then the footage is no longer just a record of execution. It may also be a record of preparation. In one image, the figure appeared without a backpack and without some of the visible gear seen in the later footage. In another, the suspect appeared more fully equipped: backpack, gloves, mask, weapon holster, darker sense of readiness. Public discussion around those differences has fueled one of the central questions in the case. Was the earlier appearance a scouting visit, a test run, a moment of hesitation before a return under more deliberate conditions? Investigators have not publicly answered that in full, and that vacuum has only intensified the mystery. Because if someone came once, saw the camera, left, and then returned later prepared to neutralize it, that is not a casual encounter with a random house. That would suggest selection. It would suggest that Nancy's home was not just available, it was chosen. And once that possibility enters the story, everything else begins to look different. The disabled camera no longer looks like a split-second reaction. It looks like part of a plan. The long 41-minute gap feels less like a chaotic struggle and more like a controlled window. The unknown DNA stops feeling like random residue and starts feeling like fragments from a premeditated operation. Even the geography of the home begins to matter more. Isolated property, darkness, long approach, limited visibility, enough privacy for someone to believe they could enter and leave unseen. By this point, the case was no longer simply about a missing woman. It had become a national true crime obsession built around one increasingly disturbing possibility. Whoever took Nancy may have studied that house before the night she vanished. And yet, for all the fear generated by the surveillance images, the most chilling truth in this chapter is that the camera did not capture the whole story. It only captured the edge of it, a figure outside, a lens silenced, a home entered, then darkness. Inside that darkness are the questions that continue to drive everything. Who knew enough to approach that house in the middle of the night and go straight into action? Why was Nancy the target? Was this a ransom kidnapping, a staged financial motive, or something far more personal? And if the suspect really appeared before February 1, Then how many days before that night did this plan begin? Those questions are what transformed Nancy Guthrie's disappearance from a terrifying local case into something much larger. Because once you accept that the abduction may have been preceded by surveillance, the case stops being about a single intruder in a single moment. It becomes a story about planning, a story about timing, a story about patience, and above all, a story about someone who may have decided long before February 1 that Nancy Guthrie was the one person they intended to take. The deeper this case was examined, the harder it became to believe that the man outside Nancy Guthrie's home had simply appeared out of nowhere on one terrible night and vanished back into the dark. The picture that began to form was far more unsettling than that. It suggested movement before the abduction, preparation before the confrontation, and a level of patience that pushed this case away from random violence and toward something much more focused. One of the most troubling details in the public record was a date that seemed to sit in silence, unexplained but impossible to ignore. Investigators asked residents in the area to review and submit surveillance footage not only from the hours surrounding Nancy's disappearance, but also from a narrower time window on January 11. That request raised a serious question. January 11 was not the night she vanished. It was not the morning she was reported missing. It was nearly 3 weeks earlier, and yet it was important enough for investigators to publicly flag. That detail matters because law enforcement usually does not broaden a timeline that far back without a reason. It suggests that something may have happened in the area that was significant enough to preserve, compare, or trace. It may have been a suspicious vehicle. It may have been a figure moving through the neighborhood. It may have been an attempted approach. The public was not given a full explanation, but the existence of that date in the investigative timeline changed the shape of the case. It opened the door to a frightening possibility. Whoever targeted Nancy may have been thinking about her long before the night she was taken. Then came another piece of footage that made that possibility even harder to dismiss. On January 23, more than a week before Nancy disappeared, a homeowner in Tucson posted video showing a suspicious man approaching a front door during the early morning hours. The location was miles away from Nancy's house, but still within the broader northern Tucson area. The time was around 3:30 in the morning and again near 5:00 a.m. The behavior caught attention immediately, not because the man was simply wandering, but because of the way he moved. He was walking backward, not stumbling, not clowning around, not behaving like someone confused or intoxicated. He appeared to be doing it with purpose. He reversed into the motion-activated camera's detection zone so that during the first moments of recording, the lens would capture the back of his head instead of his face. That is a tiny detail, but in this case, tiny details became enormous, because the backward movement suggested not only awareness of cameras, but awareness of how doorbell cameras actually work. These systems do not always begin recording the instant a person enters frame. Many consumer security devices rely on motion and heat detection, then take a brief moment to wake, adjust, and start capturing usable footage. In ordinary life, that technical delay means nothing. In a case like this, it can become a vulnerability. A person who understood that startup delay could exploit it. If he turned his back during those first moments, he could conceal the most identifiable part of himself until the camera was fully active. That is not the kind of thing most people do instinctively in the dark outside a stranger's home. It suggests research, practice, a method. And there was something even more unsettling in the footage than the backward walk itself. When the homeowner's dogs began barking, the man did not spin around in panic and expose himself to the camera. He fled while maintaining his orientation, still protecting his face as he retreated. That kind of control in an unexpected moment points to someone who was not making this up as he went. It points to someone who had thought carefully about visibility, exposure, and risk. Why would that matter in Nancy's case? Because when the January 23 footage was placed beside the known events surrounding February 1, it began to look less like an isolated act of prowling and more like a rehearsal. The home where that suspicious encounter occurred reportedly shared environmental similarities with Nancy's property: darkness, suburban desert isolation, long approach zones, limited traffic, and the same kind of camera technology common in the area. In investigative terms, that can matter enormously. A person planning to approach one specific target may test his method elsewhere first, somewhere close enough to mimic conditions but far enough away to avoid immediately exposing the real objective. If that is what happened here, then January 23 was not random trespassing. It was practice. Then there was the backpack. The suspicious individual seen near Nancy's home appeared with a dark backpack later, identified in reporting as resembling an Ozark Trail hiker pack sold through Walmart. The January 23 footage reportedly showed a man carrying a backpack that looked visually similar. On its own, that does not prove identity. Similar gear can be purchased by many people, but in a case built on timing, pattern, and behavior, visual consistency becomes part of a larger mosaic. A backpack is no longer just a backpack when it keeps surfacing around suspicious activity, linked by geography, timing, and stealth behavior. When all of these details are lined up, the progression becomes hard to ignore. January 11 appears on the sheriff's request list with no public explanation. January 23 brings suspicious early morning activity at another Tucson home, with a man seemingly exploiting camera delay and concealing his face through deliberate movement. Then, before Nancy's disappearance, a figure is seen at her own front door without full visible equipment. And finally, on the night she vanishes, the suspect returns more prepared than before, with gear, a holster, gloves, and the apparent confidence to disable the camera and move forward. That pattern carries a very different emotional weight than a simple break-in. It suggests phases: observation, testing, return, execution. And that is exactly what makes this case feel less like an ordinary abduction and more like something constructed. The footage outside Nancy's home added to that feeling in another way. In the later images, the suspect did not seem lost or hesitant. He did not wander around the property searching for the lens or fumbling through uncertainty. He appeared to approach with intention. The movement toward the camera looked direct, purposeful. That matters because hesitation often reveals unfamiliarity. Confidence can suggest either boldness or experience with the terrain. It does not automatically identify a person. But it does create an uncomfortable question. Was this somebody who already understood the property better than a stranger should? That question became even more difficult because of what the public learned about the camera itself. Nancy reportedly did not maintain active recording subscriptions on all of her devices. That meant parts of the security system could detect motion without storing full cloud footage. If someone knew that, or discovered it during an earlier visit, the house would instantly look more vulnerable than it appeared from the outside. A visible camera often acts as a deterrent because it promises exposure. But a camera that does not fully record is a weaker threat. If the suspect realized that before returning, then the house may have seemed less protected than the public assumed. Now place that possibility next to the 41-minute window between the camera going dark and the pacemaker app disconnecting. If this was a planned entry, then the person entering the home may have done so with a degree of confidence rooted in advanced knowledge. He would know where the approach was. He would know how dark the property became at night. He would know where the visible security point was located. He might even know the routines of the woman inside. That last possibility is where this case begins to feel especially grim. Because routine is often the invisible map behind crimes like this. Nancy was not living a chaotic, unpredictable life. She was elderly, rooted, medically dependent, and described as independent but limited in mobility. Anyone watching her long enough could begin learning the rhythms of her evenings, her likely hours of rest, her level of vulnerability, and the isolation of her house after dark. The longer the planning window grows, the more possible it becomes that the abductor was not simply targeting a house. He was targeting a routine. And if routine was part of the plan, then the suspect may not have needed much time inside the home to figure out what to do. The long window may not reflect confusion at all. It may reflect control. The confrontation, if there was one, may have taken time because Nancy herself took time. An elderly victim with medical limitations can still resist, still speak, still force decisions on the attacker. The biological evidence found in the home and blood identified on the porch suggests something physical happened during that period. Not necessarily a drawn-out fight in the cinematic sense, but enough contact to leave traces behind and enough disruption for investigators to treat the scene as far more than an unexplained disappearance. The more evidence emerged, the more another issue began to trouble the public narrative. The motive still felt unstable. A ransom angle had surfaced through communications sent to media organizations, demanding cryptocurrency and implying financial intent. But the execution of that supposed ransom effort did not fit cleanly with a polished extortion operation. There was no publicly confirmed proof of life. No meaningful public indication of an organized negotiation process. No clear sign that a kidnapper with a real financial objective was steering the situation with discipline. That inconsistency forced investigators and observers alike to ask whether the ransom messaging was genuine, amateurish, or something worse. A smokescreen designed to direct attention toward money and away from a more personal motive. Because if this crime involved weeks of preparation, camera awareness, possible rehearsal behavior, and a return to one specific victim, then money may not explain enough on its own. And once the motive starts to wobble, attention naturally shifts elsewhere. Toward access, toward familiarity, toward the people, habits, and relationships surrounding Nancy's final known evening. By now, the public was no longer just staring at dark footage and hopping for a clear face. They were staring at a timeline that seemed to reach backward before the abduction and inward toward a circle of knowledge around the victim's life. Every unexplained date, every repeated behavior, every sign of planning tightened that feeling. This was not a mystery growing simpler with time. It was growing more structured, and structure is often what makes a crime most frightening. Chaos can be accidental. Structure usually is not. What happened to Nancy Guthrie may have looked at first like one horrifying moment captured at the edge of a camera frame, but the deeper investigators went, the less it resembled a single moment at all. It began to resemble a process built on patience, concealment, and repeated movement toward one destination. And if that was true, then the most dangerous part of the story was not the masked figure the public had already seen. It was everything he may have done before that. By the time the investigation reached its next phase, the public had already been forced to accept a possibility that felt darker than the first version of the story. Nancy Guthrie's disappearance no longer looked like a sudden act committed by a stranger drifting through the desert in the middle of the night. The timeline, the footage, the unexplained dates, and the behavior around the cameras had begun to suggest something else entirely. Something slower, more deliberate, more intimate with the environment than anyone wanted to admit. And yet the most difficult question still remained untouched at the center of it all. If this was planned, then who had the kind of knowledge planning requires? That question does not point automatically to guilt. It does not solve the case. It does not erase the possibility that an outsider studied the home from a distance and learned enough to act. But it changes the direction of the conversation. Because once a crime begins to look organized, the lens shifts from random danger to access. Access to the property, access to routines, access to the layout, access to the kind of confidence that allows a person to move through darkness without looking uncertain. Nancy's final known evening made that issue impossible to avoid. She had spent part of that night with family. She had eaten dinner past time in a familiar setting and then returned home. The last publicly known person to have seen her alive was the son-in-law who drove her back. According to the public account, he made sure she got inside safely, then left and returned to his own home, a short drive away. On paper, that sounds ordinary. In real life, it became one of the most closely examined facts in the entire case, not because it proves wrongdoing, but because last contact almost always matters. In major investigations, the people closest to a victim are examined first. That is standard. It is not cruelty. It is not bias. It is not accusation. It is the reality of how cases are built. The inner circle usually holds the clearest understanding of a victim's routines, vulnerabilities, habits, and movements. They know who the victim trusted. They know what was normal and what was unusual. They know what the house looked like inside and out. And when a crime scene begins to suggest familiarity rather than chaos, investigators naturally look hard at anyone who might have possessed that kind of knowledge. That is why so much attention eventually settled on the world around Nancy, not only on the masked figure outside her door. The discomfort grew because of the way the suspect moved. People who studied the available footage publicly pointed out that the individual seen near Nancy's home did not seem to behave like someone wandering into a totally unknown place. The approach appeared direct. The motion toward the camera looked purposeful. There did not seem to be much fumbling or searching. Again, that does not identify a person, and it should never be treated as proof on its own. Human behavior is messy, and footage captures only fragments. But when an intruder appears calm near a home where an elderly woman later disappears, viewers begin to ask whether the person outside the door knew more than he should have. The investigation itself only deepened that unease. Federal agents returned repeatedly to the home connected to Nancy's daughter and son-in-law. Public reporting described multiple law enforcement visits there. Search activity reportedly extended beyond simple conversation. Cameras were removed. A vehicle was impounded. The septic system was examined. Neighbors were questioned. At one point, agents were seen leaving with a brown paper bag, the kind often associated with preserving biological evidence, because paper helps avoid moisture buildup that can damage trace material. None of that meant the case was solved. None of it meant charges were imminent. But it did mean investigators considered the property and the people around it important enough to revisit with serious attention. That is where the public tension around this case became almost unbearable. Because on one side, law enforcement publicly stated that the family had been cleared at that stage and should be viewed as victims, not suspects. On the other side, visible investigative activity kept circling back to the same places and the same relationships. For many observers, those two realities felt impossible to hold at once. But in truth, both can exist together. Being cleared publicly at a given moment is not a declaration that no future evidence could ever alter the picture. It simply means that based on what investigators were prepared to say at that time, they were not naming charges and were not publicly positioning those individuals as current suspects. Cases evolve, evidence changes, strategy changes, public language changes. That is why restraint matters so much in how a story like this is told. Still, the silence surrounding certain people close to Nancy only intensified public curiosity. Her family had spoken. Savannah Guthrie had made emotional public appeals. Other relatives had participated in the search for answers. Hope, grief, fear, and exhaustion had all become visible in the words of those pleading for Nancy's return. But the absence of equally public commentary from one person, particularly close to the timeline, created a vacuum. And vacuums in true crime cases never stay empty for long. People begin to fill them with theories. Some of those theories are grounded. Many are not. That dynamic had already become a major problem in Nancy's case. Tip lines were overwhelmed. Dispatch centers were flooded by speculation, psychic claims, internet rumors, and amateur deductions. Thousands upon thousands of calls made the search harder, not easier. What should have been signal turned into noise. And noise can be dangerous. It can warp public memory. It can turn uncertainty into accusation. It can make the most repeated theory feel like the most proven one, even when it is not. This case produced exactly that kind of atmosphere. One SWAT incident in Tucson involving completely different individuals exploded across social media as though it were the breakthrough everyone had been waiting for. It was not. Innocent people were pulled into the storm, and the real investigation lost clarity under the weight of public desperation. That incident became a warning of what happens when a case is emotionally charged enough that people stop distinguishing between evidence and assumption. Yet even as false leads spread, the actual evidence continued moving quietly forward. The forensic side of the case may ultimately prove more important than all the dramatic speculation surrounding it. The unknown DNA found in the house, the separate unknown DNA from the glove, the possibility of mixed samples that require time-consuming separation, the private lab analysis, the genealogy route running in parallel. These are not flashy developments, but they are often the developments that matter most. Modern investigative genetic genealogy has transformed cases once thought unsolvable. A suspect does not need to have personally uploaded DNA anywhere for the trail to begin. A relative may have done it years ago. A distant cousin, a second cousin once removed. A family branch sitting quietly in a public genealogy database can become the start of an investigative map that narrows with each generation. And in Nancy's case, there were potentially two such biological trails. That is why the long-term outlook of this investigation may be more dangerous for whoever was involved than the early public chaos suggested. Public attention fades. Search helicopters leave. Reward numbers stop making headlines. The noise settles, but the evidence stays. It gets retested, re-examined, compared, profiled, traced through purchases, records, DNA, retailers, and movement patterns. A glove found in a field may matter months later in ways nobody fully understands now. A holster shown to local gun shops may trigger recognition from the right person at the right time. A backpack tied to retailer purchase records may place someone on security footage. A genetic clue may sit dormant until one new upload to a database changes everything. And there were already signs of that slow tightening process. Investigators were reportedly narrowing down the suspect's clothing, article by article. Shoes, pants, shirt, jacket, backpack, mask, holster. Each identified item creates another lane of inquiry, another manufacturer, another store, another sales trail, another chance that a face, a credit card, a timestamp, or a surveillance clip will line up with a broader pattern. On the surface, that sounds tedious. In reality, it is often how cases move from mystery to arrest. Not through one dramatic confession, but through 1,000 small pieces that eventually leave no room left to hide. The ransom angle, meanwhile, continued to look unstable. If money had truly been the objective from the beginning, the conduct after Nancy's disappearance did not resemble a disciplined extortion operation. Publicly known communications lacked the kind of structured follow-through expected in a genuine, controlled ransom scheme. There was no confirmed proof of life shown to the family, no clear negotiation sequence, no meaningful sign that someone was steering events toward actual payment in a sophisticated way. If the ransom communications were authentic, they looked clumsy. If they were not authentic, then they may have been planted to misdirect. Either possibility leads to the same uncomfortable conclusion. Money alone may not explain what happened. And if money does not explain it, then motive becomes more personal, more strategic, or more concealed than the public initially assumed. That is what makes Nancy Guthrie's disappearance so haunting even after all the footage, all the reporting, and all the theories. There is no neat motive sitting on the surface. There is only structure without full explanation. A woman taken from the home she had lived in for decades, a camera disabled, a pacemaker disconnect, blood on the porch, biological traces from unknown men, a suspicious figure who may have appeared before the abduction, a possible rehearsal at another home. A flagged date weeks earlier with no complete public explanation, repeated investigative focus on those in the victim's orbit, silence in places where the public expected pleas, noise from thousands of false theories, and behind all of it, an increasingly sharp sense that this crime was not impulsive at all. It was built out of timing, built out of opportunity, built out of someone's knowledge of where Nancy lived and how vulnerable she might be once the night turned deep enough. That does not tell us exactly who did it. It does not answer whether there were two offenders, one offender with contamination, or a more complicated sequence still hidden from the public. It does not tell us whether Nancy was alive after she was taken, whether the desert itself swallowed the trail, or whether the answers were always closer to home than anyone wanted to believe. But it does tell us this. The first version of the story was too small for the crime it was trying to explain. Nancy Guthrie did not simply vanish into mystery. She vanished into a case shaped by planning, patience, and evidence that seems to point in multiple directions at once. That is why this story continues to grip people so intensely. Not because it offers easy villains or tidy revelations, but because every serious detail seems to widen the unease rather than resolve it. Each new piece of information does not close the circle. It makes the circle larger. And somewhere inside that larger circle is the truth. The person or people responsible may still be counting on distance, darkness, and delay. They may be counting on the public to grow tired. They may be counting on the confusion of the early investigation, the flood of bad tips, the false ransom notes, and the unresolved public theories to keep the case blurred long enough for them to disappear into ordinary life. But cases built on evidence do not disappear that way. They slow down. They go quiet. They become less visible. And then sometimes, when almost nobody is expecting it, they return with a name attached. For Nancy's family, every day without answers has been agony. Their words made that painfully clear. Hope has had to live beside dread. Faith beside realism, public appeals beside the possibility of a worst-case ending no one wants spoken aloud. That emotional reality has always been the human center of this case. Behind every timeline, every camera angle, every DNA profile, and every suspicious movement in the dark is an 84-year-old woman whose absence ripped through the life of an entire family. That is the point that should never get lost. Not in the theories, not in the noise, not in the endless attempts to force certainty before the evidence is ready to give it. Because the real power of this case is not that it allows people to speculate. It is that it keeps demanding discipline. It demands attention to detail. It demands patience. It demands the willingness to sit with what is known, separate it from what is guessed, and understand that the most frightening cases are often the ones where the truth is not obvious because it was carefully hidden from the start. And if that is what happened here, if Nancy Guthrie was taken as the result of a plan that began long before the night she vanished, then the case may not ultimately be broken open by the dramatic image everyone first saw. It may be broken open by the quieter things left behind. The evidence no one could talk its way out of. The trace no darkness could erase. The pattern no rehearsed silence could keep buried forever.